talked about reconnection to something in your heart that you may have turned away from or didn't know was there.
He stopped mid-line, not because he forgot the words, not because the melody failed him. He just stopped. The room didn't react at first. No one spoke. No one moved. It took a few seconds before someone realized this wasn't a pause for breath. This was something else. Steve Perry lowered his head slightly, as if listening for something that wasn't there anymore. Then he stepped back from the microphone. That was the moment the song disappeared. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. At the time, no one thought it would last. Artists walk away from songs all the time. They shelve ideas. They come back later with fresh ears. They decide something isn't right yet. That's what everyone assumed this was. But the song didn't get revised. It didn't get rewritten. It didn't even get criticized. It was simply left behind. And Steve never offered an explanation. What made it unsettling was how finished it already sounded. This wasn't a rough draft or a loose idea. The melody held together. The structure was there. The emotion, unmistakably there. Too unmistakable, maybe. People who were present noticed the shift before they understood it. His voice hadn't cracked. His confidence hadn't vanished. But there was a restraint now, a careful distance, like someone who suddenly realized how thin the ice was beneath their feet. When the song came up again, gently, cautiously, he deflected. He said it wasn't the right time. He said some things don't need to be shared. He said instinct told him to leave it alone, all reasonable answers. And still, something didn't add up, because Steve Perry had never been afraid of emotion. His entire legacy was built on leaning into it, on letting longing spill out of his voice in a way that felt unguarded and real. So why hesitate now? The people closest to him sensed there was more beneath the silence, but they didn't press. There was an unspoken understanding that pushing would only make him retreat further, and he did retreat. Not from music, not from singing, just from that song. That distinction mattered, because walking away from one song, only one, suggests intention. It suggests a boundary, a line he didn't want to cross, even privately. The lyrics were never discussed in detail, not because they were controversial, not because they were explicit, because they were specific. Too specific. Steve Perry had always mastered the art of emotional distance. His songs felt intimate without revealing names, personal without exposing wounds. Listeners heard their own stories in his voice, not his. This song didn't allow that. It pointed inward, and that's where the discomfort lived. Years later, people would speculate. Some said it was about control, about protecting his voice, his legacy, his image. Others suggested fear of change, fear of not sounding the same as he once did. But those theories never quite fit, because he wasn't afraid of being heard. He was afraid of being recognized. There's a difference. Those who worked with him described the moment not as dramatic, but as heavy, like the air shifted without warning. No argument followed. No explanation was demanded. Just a quiet understanding that something had crossed from creative into personal. And once that line was crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. The song became a kind of absence, not erased, just untouched, like a door no one opens anymore because they already know what's on the other side. Steve never denied its existence. He simply didn't invite anyone closer to it. In interviews, he spoke about instinct, about listening to what feels right, about honoring silence as much as sound. But when asked about that specific song, his answers shortened. His tone softened. The subject changed. That wasn't an accident, because some songs don't ask to be performed. They ask to be confronted. And this one asked too much. From the outside, it looked like restraint, like discipline, like an artist protecting himself. From the inside, it felt different. It felt like avoidance. Steve Perry had spent decades turning vulnerability into something beautiful, something shared, something survivable. This song stripped away the beauty part. It didn't dramatize pain. It didn't romanticize loss. It didn't soften the edges. It just sat there, honest and unguarded. And honesty without distance can be unbearable. The strange part is that nothing forced his hand. No label pressure, no deadline, no conflict that demanded a choice. He chose silence on his own, which makes the question harder to escape. What was in that song that made silence feel safer? Because whatever it wasn't about the audience. It wasn't about critics. It wasn't even about legacy. It was about something he wasn't ready to name. And as long as the song remained unsung, that thing could remain untouched, for a while at least. Silence has a way of growing. At first, it feels temporary, like something you'll come back to when the timing feels right. But over time, silence settles in. It becomes familiar, almost protective. That's what happened to the song. Months passed, then longer than that, and the song stayed where it was left, untouched, unspoken, not rejected, just avoided. Steve Perry continued on. From the outside, everything looked steady. He still sang, still recorded, still showed up when expected. But there was a subtle narrowing to his world. Those close to him noticed how carefully he chose what to revisit. Old songs were fine. Familiar emotions were fine. Stories that had already been shaped into something manageable, but anything that pointed too directly at the present? He stepped around it, and the song sat right in the middle of that present. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't memory. It wasn't reflection. It was now. People assumed time would solve it. That distance would dull whatever edge had stopped him in the first place. That eventually the song would feel safer. Time did the opposite. The longer it remained unfinished, the more weight it carried, like a thought you avoid so thoroughly that it starts following you. Steve never said he was afraid of the song, but he didn't have to. When someone mentioned it casually, not even pushing, just acknowledging it existed, his body language changed. His answers became careful, measured, almost rehearsed. He spoke about protecting the music, about respecting boundaries, about knowing when to stop. All true, and still incomplete. Because boundaries aren't usually built around songs, they're built around feelings. Steve Perry had always understood the power of restraint. He knew what to give and what to keep. His voice revealed emotion, but his life stayed mostly out of frame. This song threatened that balance, not because it exposed secrets, but because it removed the filter. It didn't transform pain into poetry. It didn't disguise truth with metaphor. It didn't give him room to step back. It asked him to stand inside it, and stand there alone. There's a moment artists rarely talk about, the point where something stops being creative and starts being personal. When a song stops serving the listener and starts demanding something from the singer. That's where he stopped. And once you stop there, going back becomes harder than moving forward. Over time, people stopped asking directly. They learned to sense when a topic was closed, even if it was never declared that way. The song became a quiet understanding, something everyone knew not to bring up. But silence doesn't erase questions, it sharpens them. Steve Perry had built his career on openness, on letting people feel close without letting them all the way in. It was a careful, generous balance. This song didn't allow for that generosity. It was too honest, without being loud, too specific without being dramatic. And that made it dangerous, because honesty like that doesn't stay contained. Once spoken, it changes things. It changes how people listen. It changes how they look at you. It changes how you look at yourself. And Steve Perry understood that better than most. There were moments, years later, when it almost surfaced again. A comment here, a hint there, a sense that maybe he'd found the distance he needed. But each time, he pulled back. Not abruptly, not defensively, just enough. like someone closing a door quietly so no one feels shut out, even though they are. What complicates this story is that Steve Perry wasn't hiding from the world. He was protecting something fragile, and whatever that was, it wasn't something applause could fix. People often assume artists fear failure, that they avoid things because they're not confident enough. This was the opposite. This song was too true to fail, and that's what made it unbearable. There's a particular kind of courage required to share something before it's been softened by time, before it's been shaped into something safe. Steve Perry had done that before, but always with just enough distance to survive it. This song removed the distance. It didn't ask him to perform. It asked him to admit, and admission has consequences. The song stayed silent, but it didn't fade. It lingered in the background of everything else, a presence defined by absence. And the longer it stayed there, the clearer it became that this wasn't about artistic choice. It was about readiness, or the lack of it. Because some truths don't care how talented you are. They don't care how many times you've survived similar feelings before. They wait until you're willing to meet them without armor. Steve Perry wasn't there yet, and maybe he knew that forcing himself would cost more than he was willing to pay. But silence has its own cost. And as the years passed, that cost grew heavier, even if no one could see it. There's a point where silence stops protecting you. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with drama. It just slowly changes from shelter into weight. For Steve Perry, that shift happened quietly, not in a studio, not on a stage, but alone, with the song still sitting where he'd left it. By then, enough time had passed that people assumed the story was finished, that the song had simply been another creative crossroads, another decision lost to history. But it wasn't lost. It was waiting. What finally brought clarity wasn't pressure from outside. It wasn't a question from an interviewer or a moment of nostalgia. It was the realization that the song hadn't been asking him to perform it. It had been asking him to accept it. Because the truth was simpler and harder than anyone imagined. The song wasn't about a moment that had already passed. It was about something still happening, still unresolved, still tender, still close enough to hurt. Steve Perry had spent years singing about love after it broke, longing after it faded, loss after it had settled into memory. This song didn't come from after, it came from during. And during doesn't offer perspective. It doesn't offer distance. It doesn't offer safety. It asks you to stand inside the feeling without knowing how it ends. That was the part he couldn't do at the time, not because he lacked courage, but because he understood the cost. Singing that song would have meant admitting, publicly and privately, that something essential was unfinished, that a wound hadn't scarred over, that a part of him was still waiting for something he couldn't name. And once a truth like that is spoken, it can't be taken back. It changes how people hear you. It changes how they see you. Most of all, it changes how you see yourself. Steve Perry chose to wait instead, not to erase the truth, but to let it become survivable. Years later, when he finally spoke about that period with more openness, the tone wasn't regretful. It was careful, measured, full of understanding for the man he had been. He didn't frame it as fear. He framed it as timing. Some truths, he explained, aren't meant to be shared while they're still bleeding. They need air. They need time. They need space to become something you can hold without breaking. The song wasn't abandoned because it was painful. It was set aside because it was honest. Too honest for the moment it was written in. And that's the part that often gets missed. Walking away wasn't failure. It was restraint. Steve Perry didn't stop because he couldn't sing it. He stopped because singing it then would have cost him more than silence ever could. The song wasn't asking to be finished. It was asking him to be ready. And readiness isn't something you can force, no matter how gifted you are. By the time the truth finally settled into something calmer, something quieter, the song no longer felt urgent. Its purpose had changed. It had already done what it needed to do. It had stopped him long enough to listen. In the end, the most revealing thing about that song isn't that it was never released. It's that it didn't need to be. It served its purpose without ever being heard. It marked a boundary. It preserved something fragile. It gave him permission to wait. And sometimes that's the bravest choice an artist can make. Not to share everything, not to explain everything, but to know when a truth belongs to you alone, at least for a while. That's the song Steve Perry walked away from, not because he couldn't face it, but because he respected it enough to wait until he could, and in that silence, something quietly healed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to move forward without betraying himself. Enough to let the song remain what it always was. A truth that didn't need an audience to be real.